You want to put yours on?
Yep.
Then we'll move mine.
What's your name again, sir? All right, I know my partner in brown here already searched. Do you have anything else on you?
No, sir. I think you're a partner.
She made coffee every morning at 6. Jan Metzig had done it the same way for 30 years. 2 scoops of ground coffee, a ceramic mug with a small chip on the handle that she had always meant to replace, but never did. The kitchen window faced east, and she liked to watch the light come in over the tree line while the machine ran. She would never make that coffee again. Neither would David. On the morning of November 14th, 2019, in a quiet home near Wolf River, Wisconsin, David Metzig and his wife Jan were found dead. Their bodies were wrapped in blankets. The house was still. The car in the driveway was gone. And their son was at a gym 25 miles away, working out, calm as still water. This is the story of how a family ended in a single night. It is the story of a planned killing, and it is the story of what investigators found when they started pulling at the threads. Some of what they found no one was prepared for. Everything still had a shape. Wolf River, Wisconsin is not a place where violent things happen often. It sits in the northern part of the state where the land opens up into forest and farmland, and the nearest city feels like a different world. The houses are spread apart. People know their neighbors, but not too well. There is a particular kind of quiet to places like this, a quiet that feels like safety. The Metzig property was a single-story home set back from the road. David Metzig was 67 years old. He had worked most of his adult life in trades, the kind of man who built things with his hands and did not talk much about himself. Jan was 65. She had worked as a school administrator for over 2 decades before retirement. People who knew them described the couple the same way, almost word for word. Steady, private, good people. Their son Erik was 25 years old and lived with them. That detail matters. He did not visit, he lived there. A grown man sleeping in a childhood bedroom in a house his parents owned in a town where nothing was supposed to go wrong. On the evening of November 13th, 2019, the Metzig household looked like any other in the area. No visitors, no known conflicts recorded that night. Whatever happened inside those walls in the hours that followed, it began in a house that looked from the outside completely ordinary. That is often how it starts. The threat is never a stranger at the door. Sometimes it is already sitting at the dinner table. There is always a moment before the moment. In nearly every case of premeditated homicide, investigators eventually find the evidence of planning. Not impulse, not accident, planning. Erik Metzig had been planning. The journal was found in his bedroom after the fact. It was not hidden especially well. In it, Erik had written out in his own hand what he intended to do to his parents and how he intended to make it look like something else. The plan, according to investigators, was to kill them and then stage the scene to suggest a disappearance, an unexplained absence, something that might be investigated but never solved. What drives a 25-year-old to plan the deaths of his own parents? That is a question the investigation would work to answer, and it is a question that, even with answers, does not entirely satisfy. What we know is this: Erik had not left. He was living at home at an age when most young adults have built some version of a separate life. The financial arrangements between him and his parents were not publicly detailed during the case, but the dynamic of a grown child dependent on aging parents under the same roof with frustrations building over time is a pattern investigators have seen in cases like this before. Dependence can turn into resentment. Resentment left alone long enough can become something darker. At some point, Erik Metzig made a decision. Not in a moment of rage, not in a flash of emotion that overtook his reason. He made a deliberate choice, wrote it down, and then waited for the night to arrive. That night arrived on November 13th. There was a point somewhere in the hours before it happened when Erik could have stopped, when the journal could have stayed in the drawer, when whatever anger or desperation he was carrying could have been walked away from. He did not stop. It was quick. That is the only mercy in a story with no mercy. Wisconsin law enforcement has not publicly released the complete forensic details of exactly how David and Jan Metzig died. What has been established through the investigation and subsequent trial is this: both were killed in their home on the night of November 13th or the early hours of November 14th. Both were found wrapped in blankets. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of an outside intruder. The person who killed them was already inside, Already known, already trusted enough to be there in the dark without raising alarm. Erik Metzig killed his parents. That finding was not disputed at trial. What struck investigators from the earliest hours was not just the act itself, but the manner in which the scene was left. The bodies had been arranged, not left where they fell, covered, placed. Someone had taken time with it after the fact in the way that a person takes time when they believe the arrangement matters. When they believe they are constructing a story that other people will accept. Erik had a story in mind. His parents had disappeared. There was no crime. There were just two people who were gone. He had written it in the journal. He believed it would work. He was wrong. He drove away from the house while his parents were still inside it. After the killings, Erik Metzig took the family vehicle and left. Where does a person go after something like that? The answer in Erik's case was a gym 25 miles away. He drove to a fitness facility, changed his clothes, and began working out. That detail is not a small one. The choice of a gym, of physical routine, of the deliberate normalcy of lifting weights and watching the clock speaks to something investigators would later analyze in depth. This was not a man in crisis running for the trees. This was a man executing a plan, maintaining a routine, creating an alibi that said, I was here. I was doing something ordinary. Whatever happened at the house, it was not me. Meanwhile, back at the Metzig home, something went wrong with the other part of the plan. A 911 call was placed from the residence in the early morning hours. The call was brief, partial, and then it was cut off. Dispatchers who receive a call that terminates without explanation do not simply log it and move on. They flag it. They send a check. When a Wapaka County Sheriff's deputy arrived at the property and began a welfare check, what they found inside was not a peaceful, empty house. It was a crime scene. 2 bodies, 2 people wrapped and left, a missing vehicle, and a son no one could immediately locate. The call that was supposed to disappear had instead opened the door. He walked in like a man with nothing to say. Law enforcement identified Erik Metzig quickly. The vehicle was registered to the family. The son was the only other resident, and the timeline of his absence from the property fit the window investigators were already constructing. Erik was located at the gym and taken into custody. He offered no resistance. That was noted. A man who has just killed his parents, apprehended by police, who does not resist, does not break down, does not show any of the outward signs of panic that most human beings would show in that moment, is already telling investigators something about himself. He sat down across the table from the detectives assigned to the case. The interview room is a specific kind of space, small, controlled, designed to strip away distraction and reduce the interaction to 2 things: the investigator and the person across from them. Everything in the room is a tool: the lighting, the silence, the way a question is framed. Erik Metzig was calm, not calm in the way that someone is calm when they have nothing to fear. Calm in the way that someone is calm when they have prepared for this, when they have rehearsed it, when they believe that calm is the right performance for the moment. Detectives asked about the night before, about his parents, about where he had been and when. He answered, and in the space between his answers, investigators began to notice the things that were not being said. The absence of grief, the absence of confusion. Most people told that their parents have been found dead in their home react with something immediate and physical. Shock, denial, tears, questions that tumble over each other because the mind is not equipped for the size of the news. Erik did not do any of those things. He was very, very still. Detectives did not break him in that first session, but they did not need to, because the journal had already been found. A confession, when it comes, is rarely the whole truth. In the interrogation setting, Erik Metzig's posture remained controlled throughout. He did not volunteer information. He answered questions with the minimum necessary to appear cooperative without saying anything that explicitly placed him at the scene of the killings. This is a pattern that trained investigators recognize. It is called strategic disclosure. The person being questioned believes they can manage the information, that by giving a little they prevent investigators from pushing for more, that a partial truth is a kind of shield. But investigators had already been to his bedroom. The journal was not a long document. It was not written with the literary ambition of someone who expected it to be read. It was a working document, a plan set down in list form in the plain language of someone thinking through logistics rather than composing for an audience. It named his parents. It described what he intended to do. It outlined how the scene would be arranged afterward to suggest a disappearance rather than a homicide. There were notes about timing, notes about the vehicle. When investigators confronted Erik with the contents of the journal, the dynamic in the room changed. He could no longer perform confusion. He could no longer perform ignorance. The document in his own handwriting had already closed that door. What followed was a process. Investigators are trained not to accept the first version of a statement after a major piece of evidence is introduced. They push, they circle back, they ask the same question 3 different ways and wait to see if the third answer matches the first. Erik eventually acknowledged his role. He did not express remorse in the way that word is commonly understood. He did not weep. He did not describe what had been going through his mind in a way that suggested he was wrestling with the weight of what he had done. He explained, "There is a difference between explaining and reckoning. One is cognitive, the other is emotional." Erik Metzig was capable of the first. Whether he was ever capable of the second is a question the record does not answer with certainty. Evidence does not lie. Evidence does not change its story. From the moment the first deputy stepped through the door of the Metzig home, a clock started running. Every surface became potential evidence. Every room told a version of the night that investigators needed to read. The forensic team documented the scene with the systematic attention to detail that is required when a case is going to court. Photographs, measurements, documentation of the position of the bodies relative to the rooms they were found in, collection of fibers, trace evidence, and biological material. The blankets that covered David and Jan Metzig were significant. The act of covering the bodies is something investigators see in cases where the perpetrator knew the victims. It is sometimes described as an expression of remorse, a partial attempt to undo the act by hiding its result. In Erik's case, it also served the practical function of his plan. Covered bodies in a house where the family has disappeared do not immediately announce themselves as murder victims. The vehicle was located. Its path was partially reconstructed. The gym where Erik had gone after leaving the property was equipped with security cameras. The footage placed him there at the time he claimed doing exactly what he claimed. But the footage also established a timeline that contradicted the story he had initially offered about where he had been the night before. The journal, once documented and entered into evidence, became the backbone of the prosecution's case. In premeditated homicide cases, establishing intent is often the most difficult part of building an argument for the most serious charges. Prosecutors need to show that the defendant did not act in a moment of passion or with diminished capacity, but that they planned, they prepared, and they executed that plan with full knowledge of what they were doing. Erik Metzig had handed them that proof in his own handwriting. The investigation also examined the financial relationship between Erik and his parents. The details that emerged painted a picture familiar to anyone who studies family-based homicides. An adult child who had not launched, parents who had continued to support him, a dynamic in which resentment had over time become something the son had decided he could resolve permanently. The case that assembled around Erik Metzig was not circumstantial. It was direct, written, captured on camera, forensically documented. There was nowhere for him to go. The law has a specific language for what happened in that house. Erik Metzig was charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the deaths of David Metzig and Jan Metzig. First-degree intentional homicide under Wisconsin law is the most serious classification for the taking of a human life. It means the prosecution is arguing, and the evidence supports that the defendant acted with full awareness of what they were doing and with the explicit intent to cause death. The journal made intent undeniable. The trial proceeded through the evidence the investigation had built. The journal was entered. The forensic findings were presented. The timeline was reconstructed through security footage and cell phone data. Witnesses who had known the Metzig family testified about the domestic arrangements in the relationships within the household. Erik Metzig was convicted. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Wisconsin, there is no death penalty. Life without parole is the maximum sentence the state can impose. It means Erik Metzig will spend the remainder of his natural life incarcerated. There is no review, no hearing at which he can demonstrate rehabilitation and ask for a chance at freedom. The door closes and it does not open again. David Metzig and Jan Metzig would not be returning to the house near Wolf River. Neither would their son. The coldest cases are the ones where the warmest places should be. The study of family homicide is one of the more difficult areas of criminal psychology, not because the acts themselves defy understanding, but because they force us to confront something we would rather not think about. The home is supposed to be safe. The family is supposed to be the unit that protects its members from the cruelty of the outside world. When the killing comes from inside, it violates something foundational in the way most people understand what family means. Erik Metzig's behavior across the entire arc of this case, from the writing of the journal to the calm presentation in the interrogation room, is consistent with what psychologists who study predatory violence describe as low reactive affect. This is not the same as having no feelings. It is the capacity to disconnect emotional response from action, to plan and execute something catastrophic while maintaining a surface-level calm that to most observers reads as either innocence or dissociation. The interrogation footage, which was referenced in court proceedings and reviewed by psychological experts, showed a man who was managing the interaction rather than responding to it. Investigators are trained to recognize this distinction. A person in genuine distress, even a guilty person overwhelmed by what they have done, behaves differently than a person who is performing the absence of guilt. The performances look similar on the surface but differ in the detail, in the micro-expressions, in the delayed responses to emotional content, in the way the body does not sync with the words being said. Erik's body and his words were not in sync. The journal also offers a psychological window that is unusual in cases of this type. Most perpetrators do not leave written records of their intent. The ones who do are often operating from a sense of control that borders on arrogance, the belief that they can construct the crime, execute it, and manage the aftermath. The journal is in its own way a statement of confidence. I have thought this through. I have a plan. I am going to do it, and no one will know. That confidence was not irrational given Erik's situation. He lived in the home. He knew the routines. He knew the house. He knew his parents in the specific way that only a person who has lived alongside them for years can know another person. He believed he understood the vulnerabilities of the situation well enough to exploit them. What he did not account for was the 911 call. The investigation could not definitively establish who made that call or why. The most plausible explanation based on the evidence is that one of his parents had enough time in the chaos of what was happening to reach for a phone. One short call, disconnected almost immediately, but logged and flagged. In a case this meticulously planned, it was a single detail that could not be controlled. That one detail brought deputies to the door, and everything unraveled from there. Before they were victims, they were people. David Metzig worked with his hands for most of his adult life. People who knew him in the community described a man who did not ask for much and did not complain about what he had. He had a dry, quiet humor. He was the kind of person who showed up when someone needed help moving something or fixing something without being asked twice. He had been married to Jan for decades. That kind of sustained commitment is its own kind of character testimony. Jan Metzig spent her professional life in schools. If you work in school administration, you spend your days thinking about young people, about how to build environments where they can grow, about what they need and what they are struggling with, and how the adults in their lives can do better by them. The people she worked alongside remembered her as someone who took that responsibility seriously. Not in a formal bureaucratic way, in a personal way. She cared about the kids in her buildings. She remembered their names. They had built something together in that home near Wolf River. 30 years and more of a shared life. The routines that seem insignificant until they are gone. The coffee in the morning. The way certain furniture gets arranged and stays arranged. The agreements spoken and unspoken that two people build when they decide to share their lives. They were not statistics. They were not cautionary figures in a story about the dangers of family conflict. They were specific people with specific histories and specific faces in the full, complicated weight of human lives that had been going on long before any of this happened. Jan never replaced the coffee mug with the chip on the handle. She did not know she would not have the chance. None of us know. That is the dimension of loss in cases like this, that the criminal record, the charges, the trial transcripts, the sentencing documents, none of it can capture. You can read the whole file and still not understand what was taken. Because what was taken was not abstract. It was two specific people who will not wake up again, whose morning routines have ended, whose voices their friends and former colleagues will spend the rest of their lives turning around in memory to try and hold on to. David and Jan Metzig deserve to grow old. They deserve to see what the next years look like. They did not get that. The warning signs are often there. The difficulty is in seeing them. Cases of adult-child familicide are more common than the general public tends to believe. The academic literature on family homicide consistently identifies several recurring risk factors: extended economic dependence, unresolved conflict between a parent and an adult child living in the same home, social isolation of the adult child, a history of the potential perpetrator expressing resentment or grievance through private channels rather than seeking help. Erik Metzig wrote his intentions in a journal. Journals are private. They exist specifically because a person cannot say what they are writing to another human being. They are the repository of the things we do not say out loud. The tragedy of situations like this is not simply that they happen. It is that they often develop over long periods of time in ways that might, with the right intervention, be redirected. Not in every case, not in all circumstances, but the accumulation of resentment, the calcification of grievance, the retreat into isolation. These are patterns that can be observed by mental health professionals, by family members outside the immediate household, by community members if anyone is paying the right kind of attention. We are not, as a culture, particularly good at paying that kind of attention. We tend to respect the privacy of family conflict. We tend to interpret signs of distress as someone going through a phase. We tend to believe that whatever is happening behind closed doors is not our concern or not our place to address. The law enforcement response in this case was, by every available measure, swift and professional. From the moment that 911 call was logged, the machinery of investigation moved quickly. Deputies were on scene. The case was built methodically. Erik was in custody within hours. But by the time law enforcement arrives, the work that might have mattered had already failed to happen. The question this case leaves us with is not just about Erik Metzig. It is about the systems, the relationships, the social structures that exist or fail to exist around people in the kind of situation he and his parents were in. About how we talk to each other about conflict. About whether we are building a society in which the people who are struggling, including the people whose struggles are creating danger for those around them, have pathways toward help before they reach the irreversible. This case did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a house, in a relationship, in a set of circumstances that had been accumulating for years before that November night. Some things cannot be undone. Erik Metzig will not be released. He will spend every year he has remaining inside a cell. The seasons will change outside. The world will continue to move through him. The house near Wolf River will stand or be sold or come down, and something else will stand in its place. Time will do what time does to every location where something terrible has happened. But David and Jan Metzig will stay exactly where they are in time. They will always be two people who trusted the person living under their roof, who made coffee in the morning and went about their lives and did not see what was coming. Who in the last moments, one of them or both of them may have known what was happening and been unable to stop it. The 911 call haunts this case, that brief disconnected reach toward help. We do not know whose voice was on the line. We do not know what words were spoken or attempted before the call ended, but we know that someone in the worst moment tried. They tried to bring help to a house where help came too late. There is a question that runs underneath cases like this one, and it is not a comfortable one. How well do we actually know the people we live with? Not the surface version of them, not the person they are at breakfast or at the dinner table, or in the moments when everything is going smoothly, but the inner life, the things they carry, the resentments they have filed away, the plans they are making in the quiet of their own minds. We tell ourselves we would know, that we would see it, that the people who are closest to us could not hold something like that without us sensing it. The Metzig case asks us to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty. It asks us to consider that closeness is not the same as transparency, that a shared address is not the same as shared understanding, that a son can eat dinner with his parents and watch television with them and wake up the next morning with a journal full of plans for their deaths. We cannot know everything, but we can pay attention. We can ask the harder questions when something feels wrong. We can build the kind of trust with the people in our lives, all of them, that makes it possible to say the difficult things before they become unsayable. David Metzig, Jan Metzig, they deserve better. They deserve to be remembered. And in remembering them here and telling this story with the weight it deserves, maybe we do a small part of that. Rest,